They laughed at me at the birthday party, called me just an old executive, and not a single person corrected them, not even him. I sat there, humiliated, forgotten, watching my life's work passed around like a joke while the man I raised soaked in applause for a story he didn't write. But what no one in that room knew, not my family, not the board, not even the man now sitting in the CEO's chair, was that the company didn't belong to him. It never had. And when the judge read the papers aloud, their faces dropped like glass hitting concrete. I was never just an old man. I was the owner. Stick around for the full story. If that twist got you curious, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to hear your thoughts. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when I pulled up to Derek's estate in Austin. A three-story mansion with marble steps, a fountain shaped like a lion's head, and hedges sculpted into initials. DM, Derek Morgan. My name. But the initials no longer felt like mine. I had brought along a bag of groceries, ribeye steaks, sweet corn, a bottle of Pinot Noir, hoping to do what I always used to do for his birthdays: grill and spend time as a family. I wasn't looking for anything grand, just the kind of gathering we used to have when Derek was a teenager, when the grill was still rusty and the backyard was just patchy grass behind our modest home in Waco. Back then, it was just the three of us, me, Derek, and his mom, who passed years ago. Derek used to sit beside me as I grilled, asking questions about work, about machines, about how to fix things. I had hoped that memory still meant something. When I rang the bell, Rachel opened the door, wearing an emerald green dress and a smile so tight it could have cut glass. "Arthur," she said, feigning cheer, "you're early." I smiled and held up the bag. Thought I'd help out. Maybe fire up the grill. Her eyes glanced down at the bag like I'd brought in roadkill. "That won't be necessary. We have chefs. You should go sit outside. Enjoy the party." I hesitated. Just thought we could do something simple. Like before. She tilted her head slightly, then stepped aside. "Old folks should just sit down and stay out of the way," she mumbled, not looking me in the eye. I heard it. So did the young catering assistant behind her, who paused mid-salad toss. I felt my ears burn. I set the groceries on the counter and turned toward the backyard, walking past smiling strangers, people I didn't know. The yard was transformed, cocktail tables with white linen, a bar with professional mixologists, string lights dangling above like a wedding. A string quartet played something light, maybe Vivaldi. I sat at a corner table near the pool, watching guests filter in. They were corporate types mostly, clean-cut men in tailored suits, women in designer dresses. Everyone seemed to know Derek. Everyone seemed to owe him something. I saw people toasting him, clapping him on the back. It was his day, and I told myself I didn't need to be in the spotlight. But deep down I hoped. Hoped for a nod, a thank you, a few words about where he came from, about me. As the sun lowered, Derek stepped onto a platform near the patio heater and clinked a glass. The music quieted. The guests hushed. He beamed. "First, thank you all for coming," he began. 40 years on this earth, and I've got a company that's breaking global records, a wife who keeps me grounded, and friends I don't deserve. Laughter. Why, think about where I started back when Morgan Machinery was barely an idea scribbled in my college notebooks. I get emotional. We had nothing, and now look at us. I froze. Scribbled in college notebooks? That company started when he was 10, watching me weld gears in the garage. I shifted in my seat. He continued. I had a few mentors along the way. One of them's actually here today. I sat up. Maybe this was it. This guy worked in operations back in the early days. Helped with the paperwork and all that. "Dad, stand up." People turned. I stood slowly, stunned. I wanted to speak. My throat tightened. "Everyone, this is Arthur, my father. He helped out in those first chaotic months." The crowd clapped politely. A few smiled. One man, in a gray suit, leaned over and whispered, "Oh, so he was like a secretary or something?" I sat back down without responding. Derek never corrected the record, never said I was the founder, never mentioned how the name Morgan Machinery came from me building engines in a one-car garage after losing my first job in '82. Nothing about how I sold our only car to buy our first lathe machine. I decided to stop by the company the following week, maybe just to say hello, maybe just to feel like I still mattered in the place I had built with my bare hands. I showed up around 10 a.m., holding a small box of pastries from my favorite bakery. The receptionist, a young man I didn't recognize, looked up confused. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked. I smiled. "I'm Arthur Morgan. I just wanted to drop something off for the staff. Used to be my place a long time ago." He stared at me for a beat, then blinked like he was trying to place me. "Oh, right. Let me check if you're allowed up." I chuckled, thinking it was a joke. It wasn't. He made a call, then hung up and said, "Mr. Morgan, Derek's assistant, says it's not a good day, but you can leave the box here. I'll make sure someone gets it." I stood there, stunned. "Not a good day?" I asked quietly. He nodded. "That's what I was told." I left the box, walked back to my car, and sat in the parking lot for a long time. I looked up at the sign on the building, Morgan Machinery, my name still shining in steel letters. But they didn't belong to me anymore. 2 weeks later, I received an envelope in the mail. It was a newsletter from the company, a glossy, full-color magazine featuring the faces of Morgan. Inside were profiles of the executive team, company milestones, and photos from Derek's birthday. I wasn't in any of them. But what caught my attention was the new corporate photo in the lobby. I recognized the space that used to be the main entry hall, and on the far wall, for over a decade, hung a large framed photo of me standing beside the first industrial lathe I had bought. A photo I'd taken with pride, a symbol of where it all began. In the newsletter, that photo was gone, replaced by a sleek digital installation showing Derek with global partners, politicians, and athletes. My stomach turned. I called Derek's office. His assistant answered, cheerful and brisk. "Oh, hi, Mr. Morgan. Derek's in meetings today. Can I take a message?" I kept my voice calm. "Just let him know I'd like to talk about the company's legacy wall." I noticed some changes. There was a pause. "I'll pass it along," she said. He never called me back. A few days after that, I went to visit Derek and Rachel at their house, hoping for a quiet word, hoping to speak father to son. When I arrived, the nanny opened the door. "Mr. Morgan," she said, looking surprised. "I don't think they're expecting you." I nodded. "That's all right. I just wanted to drop off a little toy for Max." Max, my grandson, had just turned 5. I carved a wooden train engine for him, painted it by hand like I used to for Derek when he was small. The nanny took the box but didn't invite me in. "They're having a small dinner party," she explained. "Just a few people from a firm." I peered past her and caught a glimpse of laughter, wine glasses, the faint glow of candles. My family, my blood, less than 10 feet away, and I wasn't even allowed through the door. I nodded politely and walked back to my car. That night, I sat alone in my kitchen with the lights dimmed and a cup of tea that had long gone cold. I looked at a picture on the counter. Derek at age 12, covered in grease, holding a wrench beside me in the garage. He had looked so proud, so eager. I tried to reconcile that boy with the man who now pretended I didn't exist. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Rachel. "Thank you for the toy." Max liked it. No punctuation, no warmth, no invitation. A week later, I got a call from my doctor's office. There had been some irregularities in my last test. Nothing critical, they said, but they recommended a minor outpatient procedure. I needed a family member to drive me home after sedation. I called Derek. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey, Dad," he said, voice smooth but distant. "What's up?" I explained the situation, said it would just take an hour or two. He paused. That week is crazy at the office. Rachel might be able to help." "Let me check." The next day, I got a text from Rachel. Sorry, we're tied up all week. Can you ask someone else? I didn't reply. I called a neighbor instead, a man I barely knew, but at least he said yes. But isolation only shielded me so much. The next hit came the following month when I received an email from Morgan Machinery's corporate office. It was an invitation to a regional shareholders presentation. I was still technically a minority shareholder, not by much, but enough to be notified of such events. At first, I hesitated. I didn't want to show up just to be ignored again. But something in me, maybe stubbornness, maybe pride, urged me to attend. I pressed my only good suit, shined my shoes, and arrived 10 minutes early at the hotel ballroom where the event was being held. The air inside was cool, crisp with the scent of strong coffee and polished ambition. Young executives hustled around with tablets, checking name tags, preparing slide decks, adjusting lapel microphones. I checked in, and the woman at the table looked up. Arthur Morgan, she said, voice puzzled but polite. I nodded. She handed me a plain white badge without a company logo. Others had colored stripes, red for VIPs, blue for department heads, green for investors. Mine had nothing, just my name. No title, no designation. I pinned it on and walked in. The room was full, maybe 200 people. I scanned for familiar faces, but saw none. I took a seat in the back by the water station. As the presentation began, Derek took the stage in a sharp navy suit, wireless mic in hand, his tone confident and slick. He talked about quarterly growth, new international expansions, R&D budgets. He pointed to a slide with a photo of the leadership team, his face centered, flanked by sleek, young executives I'd never met. My name wasn't mentioned. My legacy wasn't acknowledged. Not a word about the early days or the foundation laid before his reign. Then came the Q&A. I raised my hand, not to challenge, just to offer a perspective. Derek glanced my way, then looked to his assistant near the front row. She shook her head discreetly. He called on someone else. I kept my hand raised for a minute longer, then slowly let it fall. A younger man at my table leaned over and whispered, "Don't take it personally. Old-timers never get picked." I smiled faintly. He didn't mean harm. He didn't know who I was. That was the point. After the event, I waited by the coffee station. I watched as Derek shook hands, posed for selfies, exchanged cards. When he finally passed my way, I stepped forward. "Derek," I said. He turned, clearly caught off guard. "Dad, didn't expect you here." "I was invited," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I thought I might speak. Add a few words about the company's roots. He glanced around, clearly uncomfortable. "It's a very forward-focused crowd," he said. "The old stories might slow the energy." I nodded. I understand. But inside, something broke again. He patted my shoulder like one might console a stranger at a funeral, then disappeared into the crowd. I thought that would be the low point, but life had more cruelty in store. 2 weeks later, Derek was invited to speak at a televised panel on American manufacturing in the 21st century. The panel aired on national news, and I sat on my couch watching him talk about innovation, tradition, and legacy. He spoke about his visionary role in building Morgan Machinery. The host asked, "Was this a family business?" Derek paused, smiled, and said, "Let's just say I'm the first generation that made it global." That sentence cut deeper than anything he'd said before. It wasn't a slip. It was deliberate. I sat there in my living room, the television casting cold light across my chest, and felt my lungs shrink. He was erasing me in public now, not just in private rooms, not just within the company, nationally. I turned off the TV and stared at the blank screen for a long time. A few days later, I met with an old supplier I hadn't seen in years. Fred had worked with me back when I was still welding my own prototypes. He shook my hand warmly. "Arthur, man, I thought you'd moved or something." Haven't seen you in any of the new campaigns. I smiled weakly. Guess I'm yesterday's news. He frowned. Nah, that company was your baby. Everybody in the industry knew it. But your son, well, he's got a new narrative. I asked what he meant. He sighed. They're doing a new video series, the story of Morgan Machinery. Your name isn't in the script. My heart stopped for a moment. How do you know? He leaned in. One of my kids is working with a marketing agency. Says they're rewriting the origin story. Derek's spinning it like it started from a Stanford dorm room project. I laughed bitterly. There wasn't a dorm room when we started. There wasn't even insulation in the garage. Fred nodded. I know, but the audience doesn't. I didn't think much of it at the time. He had framed it like a son looking out for his aging father, offering to handle the bills and paperwork while I focused on retirement. I believed him. I trusted him. That trust began to rot the morning I found my bedroom door wide open, my belongings in cardboard boxes stacked in the hallway. Rachel stood in the middle of the room with her hands on her hips, wearing a blazer and a smile that had all the warmth of a knife. We're redesigning the upstairs into a wellness space, she said. A home gym, meditation area, maybe a dry sauna if space allows. You'll love it. We've already moved your things into the guest suite downstairs. It's cozier, easier on your knees. I stood there silent for a long moment, then asked, Did anyone think to ask me? Her smile faltered for a split second before snapping back into place. Arthur, you said the stairs were bothering you. We're doing this for your comfort. I nodded slowly. Of course. But my heart told me otherwise. This wasn't about comfort. It was about control. The room I had slept in for over 30 years, the room where my late wife and I had built our life together, was now being converted into a yoga nook. My memories were being folded up and boxed like winter coats in July. That evening, I sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed in the guest suite, staring at walls that held no history. The room smelled like unused linen and dustless furniture, polished to appear welcoming but devoid of soul. I opened one of the boxes and pulled out a photo of my wife, Eleanor, from our first anniversary. She was laughing at something I'd said, head thrown back, pure and full of life. I placed the frame on a nightstand and turned off the light. I lay in the dark, surrounded by silence that no longer felt like peace, but like banishment. A week later, the situation escalated. Rachel approached me in the kitchen with a folded brochure in her hand. Arthur, she began sweetly, I've been looking into some wonderful communities for people your age. Places where you'll have activities, medical care, people your age to talk to. It's honestly so much more stimulating than being cooped up here with just the two of us and Max running around. I stared at her, the coffee mug in my hand, trembling slightly. Are you suggesting a nursing home? I asked. She giggled. Not a nursing home, a retirement village. Active lifestyle. Think of it as downsizing with dignity. I laughed. I didn't mean to, but I couldn't stop myself. So you want me out? I said plainly. Her smile thinned. We just think you'd be happier somewhere tailored to your needs. I set the mug down and left the kitchen. Later that night, I overheard Rachel and Derek talking in the living room, unaware I was still awake. He's just taking up space, she said. He wanders. He snoops. Max is starting to ask why Grandpa doesn't work. Derek's voice followed, tired and unbothered. Just give it time. He'll come around once he realizes he's better off there. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stared at the ceiling, the fan spinning like the minutes ticking away what was left of my pride. A few days passed before they brought it up again, this time over dinner. It was quiet at first, the usual clinking of forks against plates, Derek checking his phone, Rachel sipping wine. Then Derek said, Dad, Rachel and I have been talking. There's a place just outside Austin, Woodgrove Estates. It's high-end, privacy, amenities. We've booked a tour for you this weekend. I looked at my plate, then at him. What if I say no? He paused. We're just thinking about what's best. The house is getting crowded. Max needs space. Rachel's working from home more. I looked at my grandson, who was playing in the other room. So the solution is to remove me. Rachel intervened. It's not like that. We just think you'd enjoy being around people your age. You could have your own apartment, your independence. I set my fork down. You mean alone, in a place where people go to wait for time to catch up with them. Derek's jaw tightened. Dad, don't make this harder than it needs to be. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and walked away. That night, I called Bill. How hard is it to find a one-bedroom rental these days? I asked. Bill didn't ask why. He just said, you want to come by tomorrow? I'll help you look. I packed my things quietly the next morning, not out of shame, but out of finality. Rachel came into the guest room as I zipped the last suitcase. Arthur, this is so unnecessary. We're not kicking you out. I looked at her. But you already did. She didn't reply. It wasn't much. Peeling paint, a leaky faucet, and windows that screamed every time the wind touched them. But it was mine. No one told me where I could go or what space I was allowed to occupy. The first few weeks passed quietly. I busied myself with small routines, fixing things around the apartment, walking to the grocery store, and catching the occasional baseball game on an old television. But the silence of my life had a weight now. Not the peaceful kind that comes from rest, but the heavy silence of being forgotten. I hadn't seen Derek or Rachel or my grandson Max since I left. There were no calls, no texts, not even a message on my birthday. It was like they had wiped me from their world the way Derek had wiped me from the company's narrative. Still, I kept my head down, told myself that peace was better than pain. That was until the Chamber of Commerce reached out. They were hosting an awards banquet to honor business leaders who had impacted the region over the past 50 years. One of the organizers, a woman named Linda, who remembered me from my early welding days, called and said, Arthur, we're inviting you as a guest of honor. Your name came up more than once. People still talk about what you built. I was surprised, even a little touched. Are you sure Derek will be okay with that? I asked. She laughed softly. It's not about Derek. It's about you. For the first time in months, I felt something stir in me. I dusted off my old gray blazer, the one I used to wear to board meetings back when my opinion mattered, and I even got a haircut. I arrived early, the way I always do, and was shown to a seat at the front of the ballroom. The space was elegant but humble, with round tables draped in navy linen and flickering candles nestled in glass jars. I scanned a room and recognized faces I hadn't seen in years. Former employees, suppliers, even a few old competitors. They greeted me warmly, and for a moment, I felt like I belonged again. But that moment didn't last. Just before the program began, I noticed Derek walking in, flanked by two executives and Rachel in her signature designer heels. They made their way to the front without acknowledging me, even though our eyes met. Derek took the stage during the main presentation, and I felt a mix of pride and nausea watching him address the audience with the same confidence I once admired, now laced with a cold polish. He began by thanking the chamber and quickly shifted into a speech about growth, vision, and legacy. I waited for a mention of me, just a nod, a sentence, even a word, but never came. In fact, midway through his speech, he gestured toward the company's history and said, when I stepped in to lead Morgan Machinery, it was a small regional firm with good intentions but outdated practices. We had to modernize from scratch, rebuild the entire system. A quiet murmur passed through the room. I saw a few older guests glance at me, unsure how to respond. I sat still, hands clenched in my lap. Then came the panel discussion. The moderator asked about family influence and how it played into company culture. Derek laughed. My father was a good man, he said, but he came from a different time, different ideas. It's like comparing steam engines to AI. The room chuckled politely. He went on, sometimes, to move forward, you have to break from the past. I stared at him, unblinking. This wasn't omission anymore. It was mockery. My jaw tightened. I wanted to stand, to speak, to shout, but my body refused. My throat was dry, and my mind spun in circles, replaying decades of sacrifice now being reduced to a punchline. After the event, people mingled with wine glasses and business cards. A former engineer I knew approached me, his voice hesitant. "Arthur, I didn't expect that speech." I nodded. "Neither did I." He paused, then said, "Everyone knows who started that company. Don't let this rewrite the truth." I gave him a tired smile. The truth doesn't change just because someone won't say it out loud. Derek passed by me at the bar, pretending not to see me. I turned to face him and said quietly, "You could have said one kind thing." He stopped, barely glancing back. This night wasn't about nostalgia, Dad. It was about moving forward. I watched him walk away again, the same way he walked out of my life when I became inconvenient. I stood there alone, feeling eyes on me, not from pity, but confusion. They didn't know what to make of a man erased from his own story. Later that week, I learned from a contact that Derek had instructed the event organizers not to list me as a founder in the program. "Keep it consistent with our branding," he'd said in an email. My hand shook when I read that line. Not only was I being humiliated in private and ignored in family circles, but now I was being publicly stripped of my identity, rebranded as irrelevant for the sake of optics. I sat down at my desk that evening and pulled out the one thing they couldn't touch, a folder of original documents. The founding contracts, the first business license, old meeting notes with my signature on every page. I ran my fingers over the paper, brittle with age, but loud with truth. It hit me then that this wasn't just hurt. It was war. I hadn't wanted one, but Derek had declared it when he turned my life's work into his playground and discarded me like expired inventory. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't fume. I sat still and made a decision. I was done letting someone else narrate my legacy. If he wanted to pretend I never existed, then he'd soon learn that erasing a name doesn't erase a man. The night after the awards banquet, I sat in my apartment surrounded by the remains of the evening, my unworn name badge, the untouched copy of the event program, and the echo of Derek's dismissive voice still haunting the corners of my mind. I thought the humiliation in front of strangers was the final blow, the last straw in a long line of erasures. But I underestimated just how far Derek was willing to go to sever the last threads that connected us. I tried to carry on with my daily life, refusing to let the bitterness consume me, yet the shadows of what had happened clung to me. A week later, I ran into an old friend, Peter, who had worked with me on our very first production line. We met for coffee at a small diner just off the highway. He looked at me, puzzled. "Arthur," he said, "I heard something strange. Is it true you're no longer listed as part of the company's founding board?" I blinked. "What do you mean?" He pulled out his phone, opened a Morgan Machinery investor site, and showed me the leadership history tab. There, in slick animated transitions, was a timeline that began with Derek. Not one mention of me, not even as a former CEO or chairman. My name had been deleted like a typo. My chest tightened. Peter looked angry on my behalf. "That's wrong. That's not just spin. That's theft." I nodded, but my voice was stuck somewhere deep in my throat. I couldn't speak. I just stared at the screen, watching my legacy vanish under a cascade of digital propaganda. Still reeling from that, I tried to get some clarity from the company itself. I reached out to Susan, one of the original board members who still held a seat thanks to her long-standing investment. She answered cautiously, her voice low like she didn't want to be heard. "Arthur," she said, "I'm so sorry. I voted against it, but the others went with Derek. He told them it was a necessary step in rebranding. Said it would simplify messaging to investors and help with international expansion. I clenched my jaw. Did any of them even question it? She hesitated. Some did. But Derek controls their seats now. You gave him those rights years ago, remember? I had. I had signed them over when I retired, believing he would preserve the spirit of what we built. I thanked Susan for her honesty and hung up. I stood in my small kitchen for a long time, staring at the fridge, the hum of its motor the only sound in the room. I opened the drawer beside the sink and pulled out a faded copy of the company's original mission statement. I had typed it myself in 1985 on a borrowed typewriter, words full of grit and hope. A company built on respect, family, and the unshakable belief that legacy is earned through integrity. That document meant something once. Now it was just paper. But Derek wasn't done. 2 weeks later, I found out that he was holding a private family council meeting, the kind we used to have once a year back when the company was still small and our name still meant something. I only found out because a former employee, Janice, bumped into me at the grocery store. "You going to the council meeting next weekend?" she asked. I shook my head. I wasn't invited. She looked confused. "It's supposed to be family." I gave her a small smile. Apparently, that definition's changed. I went home and sat in silence for hours. They weren't just leaving me out of company history. They were leaving me out of the family altogether. A few days before the meeting, I drove past the company headquarters, needing to see it with my own eyes. The building had changed, sleeker now, modernized, wrapped in glass and steel like a fortress. But what hit me hardest was the new signage being installed across the front lawn. I parked and walked up to the edge of the grass, staring as workers mounted large metal letters into the soil. D-Tech Global, not Morgan Machinery. My name was being stripped from the very ground I had built with my blood and sweat. I stood there, frozen. One of the workers turned and asked, "You okay, sir?" I nodded slowly, just watching history being rewritten. He went back to drilling without a word. Later that night, I sat in my apartment with the lights off and the city humming faintly through the windows. My hands trembled as I opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet and pulled out the last untouched folder I owned. Inside was the deed to the original property, the design sketches of our first product, and a sealed envelope addressed to me from my late wife, written the year before she died. I opened it slowly, the paper brittle, but her handwriting still steady. "Arthur," she had written, "never let them forget who you are. You gave everything to this family. If one day the world turns its back on you, remember the truth lives in you, not in their stories." I read that letter over and over until dawn. 2 days later, I received a formal notice via mail. Morgan Machinery was officially restructured and would no longer recognize any legacy affiliations prior to the leadership change in 2015. That year marked when Derek took over. Everything before that, every decade of sweat, every contract, every achievement, was now considered pre-acquisition history. I held the letter in my hand, stunned. They had buried me in legal language. I was now a relic of pre-acquisition, like some forgotten piece of outdated equipment. But that morning, as I sat in my tiny apartment flipping through some old company files, I discovered something I had long forgotten: a transfer agreement. It wasn't just any agreement. It was the legal document, signed by both me and Derek, that detailed the temporary appointment of Derek as CEO in 2015 under the condition that full ownership would revert back to me if certain performance benchmarks weren't met by 2020. I remember drafting it with my old attorney, Frank Willis, back when I still had hope in Derek's leadership, but wanted a safety net in case he veered too far from the company's founding values. At the time, Frank had insisted we insert a clause that required annual performance disclosures, signed audits, and a transparent report to me as the principal shareholder. Derek had agreed, not knowing that this clause could one day be used to pull the entire foundation out from under him. I read the document over and over, my hands trembling not from weakness, but from adrenaline. Every inch of my soul screamed for justice. Derek had never fulfilled those obligations. In fact, he had actively hidden performance reports, never sent me the required updates, and had changed the company's structure without my approval. Legally, the contract was still active. He wasn't the rightful owner. I was. I made an immediate call to Frank, who, to my relief, was still practicing law out of his small office near downtown. When I explained what I had found, he asked me to come in right away. Within an hour, I was sitting across from him in a room filled with legal books and framed photos of cases won. Frank read the agreement carefully, then looked up at me with raised eyebrows. "Arthur," he said slowly, "this is ironclad. And for what you've told me, Derek's in breach on multiple levels." I nodded. He erased me from the company, from the history, from the family. But he did it while standing on ground that was still mine. Frank leaned back in his chair. "Then we're going to make this right. But we do it quietly. If we play this smart, he won't see it coming." Over the next few weeks, Frank and his team built a case, gathering evidence of Derek's violations, collecting public records, screenshots of company restructuring without board consent, and correspondence that proved Derek had knowingly violated the agreement. I stayed quiet, patient, and careful. The anger inside me had transformed into focus. I was no longer seeking recognition. I was seeking justice. What Derek had taken wasn't just a business or a name. It was my life's work, my reputation, and the dignity that should have been mine in the twilight years of my life. The real opportunity came when Frank discovered that Derek had filed for a major expansion loan from a national bank. The loan approval required full ownership verification, and if we timed it right, we could challenge the validity of that verification in court, potentially halting the loan and drawing public scrutiny. It wasn't about destroying Derek. It was about forcing him to admit, in front of witnesses and records, that he had built his empire on a lie. Frank filed the challenge quietly, requesting a court review of the ownership structure based on the 2015 agreement. The hearing was set for 2 weeks later, and the moment I saw the court's stamp of approval, something inside me shifted. I wasn't invisible anymore. I had proof. I had rights. And soon, I'd have a voice again. During those 2 weeks, I kept a low profile. I didn't tell anyone. I went about my days as usual, nodding at neighbors, visiting the park, pretending like I hadn't just found a fuse to the powder keg sitting beneath Derek's empire. Frank warned me that Derek would be notified of the legal motion and that he'd likely try to get ahead of it. Sure enough, 3 days before the hearing, Derek called me. I stared at the phone as it rang, his name flashing like a ghost I didn't ask for. I let it go to voicemail. Then Rachel called. Then his assistant. Then, finally, Derek again, leaving a voicemail this time. "Dad, we need to talk. I don't know what this legal notice is about, but I think there's been some confusion. We should handle this privately, as a family." I listened to the message, then deleted it. Family? That word had long since lost its meaning in Derek's mouth. He'd used it like a shield, a way to get what he wanted without ever giving anything back. The day of the hearing, I arrived at the courthouse early. Frank met me at the steps, holding a binder thick with documents. Inside the courtroom, Derek sat at the front with his legal team, dressed in his usual tailored suit, hair perfect, expression unreadable. When he saw me walk in, he looked away. The judge entered, and the proceedings began. It was a quiet hearing, no cameras, just legal arguments and evidence. Frank laid it all out. How Derek had breached the 2015 agreement, how he had failed to provide the mandatory reports, how he had altered the company without consent. Derek's lawyer tried to dismiss the claims as outdated or irrelevant, but Frank's documentation was airtight. The judge reviewed the agreement, listened carefully, and said, "This contract is valid, and from the evidence presented, it appears Mr. Derek Morgan is in violation of its terms. Derek shifted in his seat. The judge continued, "Given the clear language of ownership reversal upon breach, I am issuing a temporary injunction on all company actions until a formal review is completed. Effective immediately, Mr. Arthur Morgan is recognized as the principal shareholder of Morgan Machinery." My heart pounded. The words hung in the air like thunder. Derek sat motionless, stunned into stillness by the words he had not anticipated. His eyes, once full of the smug certainty of a man in complete control, now flickered with disbelief and panic. The gavel came down. Temporary injunction granted. Principal shareholder, Arthur Morgan. It was done, at least for now. Frank placed a firm hand on my shoulder as we walked out of the courtroom. "That was the first step," he said. "But there's more to come. He'll fight this. Be ready." I nodded, my pulse still thrumming with adrenaline. I've been ready for years. You just didn't know it. That afternoon, word spread like wildfire. Frank's office had barely closed its doors when I received 3 voicemails, 2 from local business reporters and 1 from an industry publication wanting a quote about the court decision. I gave none. I wasn't interested in interviews or headlines. Not yet. I wanted my next moves to be felt, not talked about. What I needed first was a meeting with the board, and Frank made that happen within 48 hours. On the day of the board meeting, I wore the same gray blazer I'd worn to the Chamber of Commerce event. This time, not as a forgotten guest, but as the man holding the company's reins. The conference room inside Morgan Machinery's corporate headquarters hadn't changed much, except for a few sleeker chairs and a fresh coat of arrogance. I arrived early, stood at the head of the table, and waited as the board members filed in. Some looked confused. Others looked nervous. A few couldn't meet my eyes at all. Derek entered last, flanked by his assistant and corporate counsel. He paused at the doorway, as if hoping this was all a misunderstanding that would vanish if he blinked hard enough. "Arthur," he said, his voice tight, "this isn't necessary." I raised a hand. "We're not doing this the old way, Derek. We're doing it the right way." I turned to the board. As of the court's preliminary ruling, I'm the recognized principal shareholder, and I'm exercising my right to call an emergency leadership review. Gasps fluttered around the room. Derek's lawyer objected, but Frank handed the secretary the injunction paperwork and the original agreement, stamped and signed. "We're within our rights," he said simply. The vote wasn't even close. 6-2 in favor of removing Derek as CEO, pending full ownership review. He still held an executive title, for now, but his powers were frozen, his decisions subject to board oversight, and his ability to act unilaterally revoked. As the motion passed, Derek stood there, flushed and livid, but not surprised anymore. He knew he'd been outplayed. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply said, "We will conduct a full audit starting immediately. I want transparency restored, employee policies reviewed, and any name branding changes paused. Effective today." I looked directly at him. "You can remain as an advisor if you cooperate, but any resistance will be documented and used in court." Derek didn't say a word. He walked out of the room, his footsteps heavy with a weight he wasn't used to carrying, accountability. That night, I stayed late in the office, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel it again. The hum of the building, the quiet rhythm of the air conditioning, the click of the elevator far down the hallway. It was all familiar, like finding a part of myself I thought had died. I sat behind the desk in the executive suite, not Derek's polished office on the top floor, but the original one I used to occupy, now relegated to a heritage room. I asked facilities to clean it up, restore it to working order. I didn't need luxury. I needed grounding. I pulled open the old drawers and found a few forgotten notes, a key to the factory floor, a photo of the original team. I stared at it for a long time, then placed it on the desk where it belonged. Over the next week, the company began to change. Subtle at first. Department heads reported to me for interim check-ins. HR conducted surveys, and employees, especially those who'd been there over a decade, came forward quietly to thank me. "We thought you were gone for good," one older engineer told me. "But we never forgot." The younger staff looked at me with curiosity, unsure what to make of the man who now stood at the center of a story they'd never been told. So I told them. I held a town hall, not televised, not recorded, just a real conversation. I stood on the same small stage Derek had once used to mock me and said, "I started this company in a garage with nothing but scrap metal and secondhand tools. I built it so people could build their lives with dignity." Somewhere along the way, the story changed. But I'm here now to make sure we don't forget what this company stands for. The room was quiet. Then one person clapped. Then another. Then the room roared. I wasn't looking for applause, but I accepted it because it meant they were listening. Of course, Derek didn't stay silent. He made his rounds in the media, claiming this was a technical dispute and that leadership transitions were natural in family businesses. But the tone had shifted. Reporters began digging. Articles emerged comparing my decades of hands-on leadership with Derek's flashy, investor-driven image. Former employees stepped forward, recounting their memories of the company's early days. One story went viral, a photo of me welding our first shipment crates by hand. It was shared thousands of times with captions like "Real leadership never rusts." The internal audit, launched immediately after my reinstatement, dug deeper than I even anticipated. For years, Derek had been quietly rerouting company funds through shell vendors and inflated consulting fees, all under the guise of modernization strategies and overseas expansion. What shocked me wasn't the greed, it was the sloppiness. He had grown so confident in his immunity that he had stopped covering his tracks. A full report landed on my desk in less than 5 days, detailing everything from inflated travel expenses to unauthorized stock options granted to Rachel, who was listed in internal records as a strategic wellness officer, a role that had no job description or measurable output. I confronted him in the very office he had stolen from me, not out of rage, but with the calm finality of a man who had come to collect what was his. Derek was already waiting, his posture tense, his eyes dull with fatigue. He knew the walls were closing in. "Is this really what you've become?" I asked, holding up the audit summary. "You didn't just try to erase me. You hollowed out the company." He scoffed, attempting to rally whatever pride he had left. "You wouldn't understand what it takes to compete today. Everything's image. Everything's speed." I leaned in, my voice low and steady. "What it takes is honesty, integrity, responsibility. You used my name to build a lie, and now you'll watch that lie collapse." Frank filed a second motion with the court, this time for permanent reinstatement and criminal review of corporate mismanagement. The court date was expedited due to the financial evidence and the public attention the case had attracted. Meanwhile, we began notifying the partners Derek had negotiated with during his tenure. The fallout was swift and brutal. One supplier pulled out of a multi-million-dollar contract, citing breach of trust. A foreign investor withdrew funding, citing misrepresentation of company leadership. Stock value dipped, not because of the leadership transition, but because Derek's practices were finally made public. Internally, employees rallied behind a return to authenticity. HR reported increased morale, and several long-tenured managers who had been pushed out under Derek's tenure returned with renewed purpose. I held one-on-one meetings with every department head, not just to assess performance, but to rebuild a bridge that Derek had burned through years of corporate theater. "You don't need to fear the past," I told them. "You need to understand it, so we don't make the same mistakes again." Rachel, unsurprisingly, went silent. She stopped showing up at the office altogether, and word quietly circulated that she had left the country for a wellness retreat in Europe. I didn't chase her down. I didn't need to. Her presence had always been more ghost than substance, a whisper in Derek's ear rather than a builder in the trenches. But the real collapse came when Derek's executive team, once fiercely loyal, turned on him to save their own skins. One by one, they stepped forward with documentation, private messages, and withheld reports, each trying to avoid the fallout. With every file that landed on Frank's desk, the foundation of Derek's power eroded further. By the time we entered the courtroom for the final hearing, Derek was no longer the man who had sneered at me during that awards banquet. He looked smaller somehow, slouched, underdressed, and weary. The court, armed with the evidence from the audit, the testimonies from former employees, and the original 2015 agreement, had little patience for theatrics. Frank laid out the facts methodically, citing every breach, every lie, every dollar misappropriated under Derek's leadership. The opposing counsel tried to argue duress and confusion regarding the agreement's original intent, but the judge wasn't swayed. The evidence was too overwhelming. At the conclusion of the hearing, the judge ruled unequivocally. Arthur Morgan was to be reinstated as the full owner and CEO of Morgan Machinery, effective immediately. Derek Morgan was barred from holding any executive or advisory position within the company for no less than 15 years and was to face civil penalties, including financial restitution and public correction of misleading statements made during his tenure. As we exited the courthouse, a small group of reporters stood waiting. I paused briefly, not for attention, but because I wanted the record to be clear. I didn't come back for vengeance, I told them. I came back for the truth. What was built by sweat and sacrifice shouldn't be buried under ego. This company was never about image. It was about people, and now it's theirs again. The papers ran with it. Headlines changed. The founder returns, one read. Justice for Morgan, said another. For the first time, the public saw not just a man betrayed by his son, but a builder reclaiming what was rightfully his. The restoration didn't happen overnight. Rebuilding a company's soul was more difficult than rebuilding its structure. But I had always believed that the people who show up every day, the ones who get their hands dirty and pour pride into quiet work, are what make a company more than just a business. That's what we focused on. The first few months under my leadership again were filled with hard decisions, but they were honest ones. We didn't chase flash or media gimmicks. We didn't hire influencers or launch hollow campaigns. Instead, we reviewed every department from the ground up, not with suspicion, but with the intention to listen. I invited employees to speak freely about what had gone wrong, what they wanted to see return, and how they defined success. For some, it was about security, a steady paycheck, healthcare, a respectful culture. For others, it was pride, being part of something that wasn't just profitable, but purposeful. We brought back apprenticeship programs that Derek had cut. We expanded mental health support. We removed layers of meaningless management that had only served as delay machines. Slowly, the heartbeat of the company returned. People stopped looking over their shoulders. They started looking forward. And every morning when I walked into the office, I didn't walk in as a figurehead. I walked in as a worker among workers. But the truth is, the greatest restoration wasn't in profits or headlines. It was in relationships, some lost, some salvaged, and some newly born from hard-won respect. One afternoon, months after the court ruling, I received a letter in the mail. No return address, just my name written in stiff, familiar handwriting. Inside was a short note from Derek. No apologies, no excuses, just a few lines. I didn't understand what you gave up. I thought building something new meant discarding the old. I was wrong. That was it. It didn't absolve him, and I didn't need it to, but it was something a recognition that the truth had pierced his armor of arrogance. I didn't write back. I didn't need to. Some closures don't come in words. They come in silence that finally stops hurting. Max, my grandson, was the one relationship I feared I'd lost for good. During the years I was pushed away, Rachel kept him distant. But now that she was out of the picture and Derek's influence had faded, Max started visiting me again. At first, it was just for an hour. Awkward, cautious, like someone exploring a place they weren't sure they were welcome in. But over time, that changed. One day, he found the old toolbox I used to carry around when I worked in the plant and asked me what the tools were for. I knelt beside him and began explaining each one. How they worked, what they fixed, why they mattered. He listened with wide eyes. "Can I come to the shop with you sometime?" he asked. I smiled. "Anytime, buddy. Anytime." That one question meant more than any court ruling or article headline. Legacy isn't just about what we build. It's about who we teach to build after us. As the company entered its next chapter, I began to think more about what my final act would look like. I wasn't trying to run things forever. I didn't want to leave with bitterness or control in my fists. I wanted to leave knowing I had restored what mattered. So I started mentoring 3 promising young leaders inside the company, not chosen for their resumes or degrees, but for their character. I brought them into meetings. I showed them how to ask the right questions, how to admit what they didn't know, and how to make decisions that would stand 20 years later. I told them, if you ever find yourself winning by erasing someone else, you've already lost. They listened, and I watched as something real began to take root again. Eventually, I stepped back, not down, just back, knowing that my presence was no longer needed for every call or meeting. The company didn't need me to hover. It needed me to trust. And I did. I returned to my simple home, repaired the garden Eleanor had once loved, and started spending mornings on the porch with coffee and the sunrise instead of spreadsheets and budgets. Some days were quiet. Others were filled with visits from old colleagues, community members, and even young entrepreneurs who wanted to hear how to build something meaningful. I never told them to chase money. I told them to chase honesty. And if they were lucky, money might follow. One evening, we held a small gathering at the company. The original team, the returning veterans, the new faces, and a few reporters. No stage, no microphone, just food, photos, and stories. As I stood in the center of it, someone asked if I ever regretted giving Derek the company in the first place. I paused. No, I said, regret is only useful if it teaches you something. I didn't regret trusting my son. I regret not making sure he knew what trust cost. But I've learned that even when you lose control, you haven't lost your value. Truth waits, and when it returns, it restores everything that matters. They were quiet for a moment. Then someone raised a toast, and laughter returned to the halls that had once gone cold. I don't know how long I have left on this earth, but I do know that I will leave it knowing I was not erased. I was not silenced. I was not defeated by pride, by betrayal, or by time. I was a man who built something, lost it, and earned it back not through vengeance, but through truth. That is a legacy no one can strip away. Not with a lie, not with a name change, not with a smear campaign, because what we build with our hands fades, but what we build with our principles lasts. I didn't just reclaim a company. I reclaimed the meaning of my life's work. And that, more than anything, is what I'll leave behind. The end. Thanks for sticking with me through my story. If what you just heard moved you, surprised you, or made you think about your own family, I'd really appreciate it if you gave this video a like. And if you want to hear more stories like mine about legacy, betrayal, and standing back up when life knocks you down, go ahead and subscribe. Also, I'd love to hear from you. What part of my story hit you the hardest? Have you ever been in a situation where people tried to erase you? Or maybe you've seen someone rise back up from being counted out. And let me know where you're watching from. It still amazes me that people from all over the country, even the world, are hearing what I've been through. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading.